Before we really get to the event proper, I'm going to pass over to Rachel Kuntz from the Inner Loop to introduce a little bit more about their Authors Corner program, which is our partnership hosting Luke Sutherland tonight and featuring him as the local author spotlight. So Rachel, I'll let you introduce a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Emily. For anybody who doesn't know, the Inner Loop is a nonprofit local to DC, and we support writers from every stage of their career. We do that through 5 programs. We have readings, writing retreats, a summer residency program, a podcast about writing craft, and through our Authors Corner program. This event is part of our Authors Corner program where we spotlight a local author who's recently published with a medium to small-sized independent press. And we kind of take over their marketing for a month, spotlight them across all of our programming and in collaborations with other local organizations such as the Writer Center. You can check out more about us at our website. And we also have more about Luke and his amazing book, Distance Sequence, on our Authors Corner page, which I'm throwing in the chat now. So we're super happy to have Luke and Distance Sequence as our book of the month.
Wonderful. Thank you. And we love everything that the Inner Loop does. So please check them out. I think a reading next Tuesday evening with Luke as well. So you can get more of his writing in a different setting there. Thanks, Rachel. And thank you for helping to make this happen tonight. Before we get started, I want to make a couple more notes. So we welcome audience questions. As the chat gets going, please just throw your questions into the chat window and I'll keep an eye on it. I have plenty of questions, but I'd much rather ask your questions than mine. So feel free to throw those in at any point. I'll keep an eye on it, and about halfway through, we'll start kind of incorporating those questions as they come in. And perhaps most importantly, we are here to support an author, and by doing so, we encourage you to purchase a copy of Distance Sequence from your local independent bookseller or online. We have a link to the publisher, Neon Hemlock, which is a local independent press. So we're really happy if you could support both the folks at Neon Hemlock and Luke and get this incredible chapbook if you don't have it ordered already. All right, I think that's all of our kind of pre-information here. So again, I'm really excited to welcome you to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Luke Sutherland here tonight to celebrate his award-winning chapbook, Distance Sequence. Luke, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Great. All right. So before we get started with the questions, could you just read a little bit of the book so we can kind of get a sense of your writing style?
Totally. So I'm going to read an excerpt from a chapter called Nurse Log. I take my shot in the Hoh rainforest, making sure B gets a good angle with the little disposable camera I'd bought at CVS. I'm always forgetting it home, letting days go by before realizing I missed a dose. But here I'm buzzing for it. My hiking bag is a temporary med kit. Alcohol swabs, syringes, band-aids, 2 gauges of needles. I'm used to injections. Pinching the fat of my stomach, angling the needle, the 1, 2, 3, go before the puncture. I rotate hormone days with monoclonal antibody ones. I forget about those shots too. The Hall of Moss's loop is short, but we spend hours on it anyway. The air is damp in my lungs, spiked with licorice fern. Lichen overwhelms the landscape. The branches of Douglas firs and Sitka spruces hang heavy with the fur of algae. Signs along the path are lyrical and strangely charged. Moldering logs, trunks shaggy with moss. Plant on plant, lush beards of club moss. And it's true, the lush shag of it all is romantic. Bacteria and fungi fucking all around us. lichen like leaves, like cracked paint, like gunpowder. B bends their head to inspect the composite, and their hair sheeted over their face looks like a red shrub of fruticose anchored to the bark. I pick a spot just off the trail and lay out my supplies on a log, the glass vial of tea nestled into decaying wood. I swab a spot just below my belly button while a family snakes down the path. I slide the needle into the vial and invert it, pulling thick liquid into the syringe, flicking out pockets of air. B is kneeling in the moss with the camera raised. I can hear the many small voices of the family. The point of the needle lingers over my stomach. There's murmuring, a shower of boot-disturbed dirt. I try not to notice them noticing me. I've spent years practicing, but I'm not very good at it. When I finally inject, B peeks around the camera to say I look metal as hell. The needle draws out a coin of blood as it exits my body. It sits there, tense, a blot of red amongst a stream of freckles. N, the first trans man I ever knew, taught me to hold the used syringe over my finger and squeeze the plunger one last time, swiping those precious drops across my upper lip and jaw. It helps the hair grow, he said. I have no idea if this is true. I do it anyway, always, and is the anointment that makes me whole. The family is gone, maybe not knowing what they saw. B embraces me, and I forget it all. I love how they witness me. I love that they know which mountains are which. I love the sound they make when they're surprised. I love how they love the forest. I love that they stopped the car the moment we saw elk. I love when they lean their head into my hand. I love that they refuse to eat anything I can't. For a few moments, there's only this. We spend a long time in the trees, on a tree, by the river. We kiss for lack of answers. I use their knife to carve. I use their knife to carve fag for dyke into the wood. Which of us is which is a matter of opinion. Much later, a man, a coworker of mine, my building opposite his, will tell the audience at a work event that trans people are pedophiles. He doesn't say it like that exactly, but we all know that what he means. I feel rattled, sick, jaded. I file complaints. I despair. I will consider quitting all of the time. I will look up the cost of my prescriptions without insurance. Still in the forest, B and I stand in front of a plaque telling us that what we are looking at is a nurse log. The massive trunk lays prone on the floor. Nooks of its body collect detritus. Moss, needles, leaf litter, and squirrel shit. A mattress of lush hummus for sprouting seedlings. A colonnade of mature hemlock straddles the log from which they grew. In another spot, the nurse log has rotted away completely. Nutrient cycle, burls break down. Its children stand on tented roots, hollow air where their parent used to be, not able to let go of the shape. A nurse log is like a whale fall. A nurse log is like a transsexual living past their life expectancy. Have I ever told N that he made my life possible? That I'm still on stilts, alive over the space he made? Thank you.
So used to snapping from poetry events, but I love that you read that excerpt because I think it really connects to a lot of this sense of genre bending and also this musicality and poetic nature of the language. So I'm really excited to talk about all that. Could you tell us just a little bit about yourself before I throw our first question at you?
Yeah, totally. So by now you probably realize my name is Luke. um, I'm a writer of many genres, not just nonfiction, also a librarian. And last year I co-founded a local small press for trans writers called Lilac Peril. and I did that with my dear friend, Andrea Tyler Morgan.
Wonderful. That's amazing. And we love librarians too. Very important to our literary community as well. All right, we'll throw the first big question at you. Since this is a chat that's really focused on this element of craft, where does thinking about the craft of writing fall into your own process? And since you work in many genres, maybe it shifts from genre to genre, but when are you like most aware of the mechanical part of the writing process versus that maybe free flowing or intuitive part of the process?
Yeah, I think for me, craft most obviously presents itself in editing. Um, the first draft for me is just kind of like, I don't want to say vomit, but it's just particularly with this project was written over the course of like maybe only a little more than a month,
Mm.
um, which is not my typical timeline. I'm typically a very slow writer. But yeah, I think the first draft is for getting it down, and later drafts are when we think about craft more critically and think about um, if think about technique really, like the technique of writing. Things like if our structure is serving its purpose, you know, is this the right tense? Is this the right POV? So yeah, I'd say craft is most on my mind in like a rewrite.
Makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I love that we call it like word vomit for those early drafts, but sometimes that mess is good, right? And then it gives you all that material to work through it and craft something beautiful out of it as well. Um, I'd love to talk about this book in particular because it's not often that we really get to discuss this kind of chapbook length project here. So could you just talk at first about how you made that decision to keep this in this sort of smaller length for this project versus extending it to a longer project? What does the form of the chapbook really give you as an author approaching this work?
Totally, yeah. So some context for like this particular project is it's written in response to a particular relationship and a particular like a very short period of time in my life. So on the one hand, like the timeline and setting being so contained lends itself to this more abbreviated format, right? And when I started writing it, it was more like my body just compelled me to do it. I needed to write something down. Um, and I've never been one to keep a diary, so the impulse to document like this was brand new to me. And what I found was trying to remember something in such detail was bringing up unrelated memories, unrelated baggage that I hadn't necessarily been dealing with. But yeah, so when I started writing this, I wasn't even thinking what will this end up being in the sense of like a packaged uh, project that others will read. I was really just kind of, again, vomiting. And it was just really good luck that the OutWrite Literary Festival was hosting its annual chapbook contest. I saw the deadline, said, I think I can make that. And it kind of gave purpose to something that may have otherwise stayed on my hard drive for the rest of my life. But yeah, I think I love short form fiction in general. And I think the chapbook, particularly, sorry, this isn't even fiction. I don't know why I said nonfiction, but I feel like the chapbook as a form is really underutilized when it comes to genres that aren't poetry. Like we're most used to consuming and writing poetry chapbooks, right? But chapbooks and novellas and zines, I think it's just there's a power in that containment and having a smaller container that we have to fit ourselves into, which isn't really a radical idea. I think people have known for a while that putting constraints on ourselves can open up new avenues of creativity, like using a really formal poetry form, for instance. So yeah, I think what the chapbook offers is a place to experiment, for sure. This is a really experimental piece of memoir, and um, a place to experiment, a place to play, and a way to sort of stretch and strain your muscles in a new way.
Yeah, I love that idea of the chapbook as a container, right? We're so used to talking about form in terms of, right, poetry, of course, but even fiction and nonfiction have those forms that are sort of inherent to structures. But it's rare that we also are like, the book is also a form or a form of constraint, and how you work within those elements and what they can kind of force you to compress or re-examine in different ways um, is really interesting. I'm curious, how do you see this work relating to the other work that you do in other genres, if you do? You mentioned that this was kind of a new impulse for you.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really an outlier for me in a lot of ways. One, in that sort of documentary
Mm.
impulse and succumbing to what I would term the trans memoir industrial complex, that there's simply too many memoirs.
Mm.
Um, so it's an outlier in terms of genre, for sure. Um, how it relates to my other work, I think that, like I was saying about the chapbook being a space for experimentation in prose writing, it gave me that room to really try something new, which if I mean, I guess almost no one has read this book yet because it literally just came out. But it's full of it's memoir, but it's full of, like line breaks where you might not expect nonfiction prose to have. There's a lot of visual ephemera, like photographs and notebook fragments. So it allowed me to really question genre in a way that I can bring back to my more typical work, which is like fiction. What it also allowed me to do is actually try to remember shit for once in
Mm.
my life. And the exercise of remembering, like I already said, brought up so much unexpected, like flotsam
Mm.
from my mind. The ability to access not only those memories, but also the exercise of noting and describing moments as deeply as possible has been really valuable to my work in general.
Mm. Yeah, I think we could really feel those deep descriptions in the piece that you read. I mean, the natural imagery sort of colliding and collapsing with the imagery of the body. Like I loved those sort of language slippages between the descriptions. So yeah, I'm really glad that you read that one because I'm sure it'll give us a lot more to talk about too. And you've already mentioned the ways that the book really brings in, sort of collects a lot of different like artifacts and pieces. And I had such an exciting time. Like every time I was turning a page, it was like a moment of surprise. Like, okay, what am I going to get next? And I love that playfulness with form. And so I wondered if you could talk about how this sort of playfulness and maybe unexpectedness or hybrid nature of form, how you see that maybe pushing against our expectations of typical creative nonfiction or what you just referenced, right? The sort of trans memoir industrial complex. How do you see yourselves kind of working against those boundaries in different ways?
Yeah. So I think what the most conventional memoir operates off of at its core is like linearity. And for so much of us, our experiences can't fit into that. and nor do we want to necessarily. I'm certainly not the first person to write an experimental memoir or even a nonlinear memoir that's not even particularly experimental in the rest of its form. But again, I think a lot of the permission I gave myself to play came was born from not imagining this would be something for an audience, you know? The relationship that this chapbook circles is a long distance one that has, for the majority of its existence, played out through letters, written ephemera, and photographs. So it was extremely natural to incorporate those things to me. It's kind of just a reflection of memory in almost a neurological sense. I mean, I know there's like everyone's brain works differently. Not everyone has the same combination of image and like word thought in their minds. But to me, that this is kind of what's the meat of the book is my neurological and like somatic experience of memory. I think I slightly forget what your actual question was, but hopefully that was something along those lines.
Yeah, no, that was great. I think um, I'm always curious about, that structure of genre that is sort of not always a writing structure, more one that comes from the publishing sphere, right? In order to fit us into these different boxes and um, the ways that it seems like from what you were saying that initial creation of the project without the expectation of publishing really allowed you this sense of freedom in a different way. Um, to play with form and to sort of give yourself permission to do something different on the page. Um, Whereas, yeah, maybe that pressure of thinking, okay, I have to write this and then turn it into a book and then get it published. It sort of constricts maybe our ideas of what the work can be. Um, it might also put some pressure on how we are able to access that story or able to be truthful to the story in some way. Um, yeah, I'm wondering too, did the pieces always start out sort of playing with form? Was there ever a moment where you were just kind of writing and then went back and started incorporating form in a different way? I'm thinking too, maybe with some of the kind of graphic pieces with like the maps and things like that. How did you start to weave those into your actual writing around those images?
Yeah. So the context there, like the maps that Emily's referring to, is there's sort of a series of three. Actually, I think it's more than three, but there's like a series of sort of hermit crab essays that are modeled after national park brochures. Um, I think some of the form was very inherent to the writing, and some of it kind of, as the project started to expand to the point where I said maybe there's something here, then I was kind of more consciously thinking about form. But the very, I'd say like the first seeds of this project was I'm totally blanking on this director's name, but the director of the film Minari. I had read an interview with him talking about how he came to write that film, which is autobiographical. And he described this exercise he created for himself where he just wrote 50 memories, 50 details. And, you know, that those details can be constrained in a variety of ways. They can be constrained to memories from a very like 1 month in your life, or memories that all happened at this same cafe. You can kind of change the constraints to suit your project. But um, I was sitting here with these really emotionally overwhelming experiences I just had, and I encountered the idea of that exercise organically, and just thought I could probably remember 50 things. And I just started writing them down in a document, like literally numbered. That is where a lot of the text of the book was seated. I don't totally remember, like, which essays came first, but I would definitely say, like, particularly the pieces that aren't as graphic, but are playing with like line breaks and negative space on the page in a way that a lot of nonfiction doesn't. That was definitely very inherent to the writing of the piece. Like those decisions weren't made later. Something like the hermit crab essays that, the text and the form weren't necessarily born at the same time.
Yeah, I love that idea, right? Can you write 50 memories? It's a good challenge for us and also a very generative exercise, just to get us to the page. I think sometimes that's the first hurdle that we come up against is sort of jumping over that edge to actually get to the page and start writing. And 50 memories can easily become so many things, as we can see here, right, in this book, the way that they've kind of been dispersed in different ways. And I love what you're saying too about the hermit crab essay. I find hermit crab forms really energizing, that like element of surprise, but also that relationship between form and content. Is that something that's really on your mind in that initial sort of connection phase when you're trying to fit a form to the writing or trying to fit the writing to the form? I guess when does that kind of relationship between the form and the content come to mind? Either like working with each other or sometimes pushing against each other in different ways.
For me, it tends to come pretty early.
Mm.
And it's one of those things that it kind of just comes from a well within you that I might not be able to identify very well to other people, like why make these decisions about form. It's kind of like I mentioned, in second drafts and third drafts and so on, when craft is more at the forefront of my mind, like then I might be questioning why this structure, why this form. But those initial choices of fucking with form for me often come from this more like primordial instinct that maybe when I'm doing rewrites, I can identify, hey, that actually like kind of amplifies what I'm saying or contradicts it, or, puts it in conversation with something new. But it's kind of that murky place where all ideas come from to begin with. And I mentioned the director of Minari, and um, it'd be a mistake not to mention another huge influence specifically on the hermit crab essays is Camellia Berry Grass and her like criminally underread. Uh, it's also an essay collection called Hall of Waters, where part of that project is she's using like land surveys, like of the forms that a land survey would be written in, to write about her childhood home and some other like crucial locales. Um, so yeah, it's really I really do believe there is something mystical isn't the word I'm looking for, but something we can't really touch with words when it comes to the origin of our ideas and our obsessions and our fixations.
Yeah. Yeah, that way that even the act of writing is sort of approximating that meaning or that experience, like trying to get as close as we can to it. And like we might be like right on the edge, but it's still like just out of reach, which is why we keep writing, right? We're still kind of cycling through in different ways. You mentioned memory a lot. And I was really drawn to the pieces with the memory work title. And we get a couple of them here. And of course, a lot of this work deals with that act of looking back and sort of contextualizing our memories in different ways. And when I think about memory and when I sort of talk to students, I think I have a couple of students in the audience too. So hi. We're always thinking about this fallibility of our memories, the way that they can become sort of malleable for us as writers, and how things might shift and change as we kind of remember these experiences. So what is your relationship like to memory as you write? How do you sort of balance that kind of truthfulness of what happened alongside that kind of truthfulness of maybe the emotional core of what happened, right? There's that sort of level of honesty in detail, but also an emotional experience too, that I think is always kind of interesting to toggle between. So I wonder what your approach is to just sort of accessing memory and maybe playing with memory a little bit as well.
Totally. With this particular project, most of the memory I was grappling with was very recent. Like the content of the relationship that I'm writing about was like immediately predated the writing. Now, the sort of triptych of pieces you mentioned, memory work 1, 2, and 3, those are largely memories reaching further back, like predating this relationship. And where those came from is, like I mentioned, when I was going through this exercise of like write 50 memories, it was bringing up these random files from my brain's hard drive. I think for one, it was those unrelated memories were coming up from the exercise of trying to remember in as much detail as possible. But also when you're in a new relationship with someone of any type of relationship, when you're building intimacy, there are those moments where it's not always a trauma, but like those core traumas come out on the table, whether you are sharing that with someone new consciously for the first time, or if it's like informing the way you interact with them. So the memory works were my way of trying to deal with and question why these traumas in the distant past were interrupting. It felt like they were interrupting my process. And at the same time of, grappling with a lot of these memories are things I hadn't told my partner yet for one reason or another. When it comes to the truth of memory in our writing, that's like a really hard question that everyone is going to approach differently. What I will say for me is truth in writing doesn't have to be documentary, strictly documentary. To me, truth, the truth of memory in writing is its texture and its atmosphere. This is how I experience the world in a particular time and place. So when we think about like factual detail, depending on the type of writing we're doing, it's going to vary how much fact matters. Um, but for me, especially in this project, the truth of it is in the texture, and texture comes from details, sensory details, particularly. So those things that make a moment strange, those images that stick with you later, like the color of a particular bird that flew by, or the smell that was in the air. What's helpful for me, and kind of also how I came to those hermit crab essays with the national park format, is if I'm really trying to render a moment from the past on the page, I'll kind of immerse myself in that moment again as much as I can, whether that's through like photos I myself took or like Google Maps. And with the hermit crab stuff, I was just on the national park website a lot because the action of those scenes were occurring in Olympic National Park in Washington. I was coming across these brochures to try and, remember the experience of being there. And my job at the time, I had access to a PDF editor. And I was like, I can just like, I wonder if I could just put whatever I want in these. And the answer was I could. Um, so yeah, that was a little bit of a wide-ranging answer, but I think the heart of what I was trying to say is the truthfulness of memory obviously is going to vary a little bit based on your project. But in personal memoir like this, to me, it's the truth is in the details. The truth is in the strangeness.
I love that you use the word texture too. I think so much of the imagery throughout these pieces is so textured. I mean, I found myself really returning to the poetic nature of the writing, which as a poet myself, I always find myself leaning towards. But I mean, not just beauty in terms of the texture, but just the level of detail, the level of sensory detail, and the way that we feel kind of transported to place. Um, and I think place kind of really functions as a really big kind of grounding element in a lot of these essays as well. So maybe we could talk a little bit about some of these settings. I mean, you talked right about the national parks, and I love, yeah, using like Google Maps and things. I'm like, what would happen if I just plop myself right back there? And I think there's this interesting duality or maybe dialogue between like East Coast settings and West Coast settings as well. But of course, the mountains and the national parks and those spaces really kind of ground us in a different way. So I'm wondering how you work to convey that sense of a place within your writing. Like, what details do you try to focus on to help build that place without the pressure of needing to capture everything in the scope of one piece? That's that kind of maybe minute world building on the level of the essay.
Totally. I think my thoughts there are actually pretty similar to my thoughts on memory, because memory is a place in a way, a place that lives in our mind. So when it comes to rendering a place on the page, I think, again, I like this word texture, is also really crucial. I was recently interviewing a comic artist, Ronnie Sam, who in her past life was also like an architect and does a lot of like architectural drawing. We had some really interesting conversations about the ways that architects are trained to think about space as a thing of control. It's sort of like a godlike perspective of the way that we design this building. It will like influence how people do anything in this space, right? And when you're a writer rendering a place on the page, I think it can be really easy to take a similar mindset. And in a way, being a writer is kind of a god complex, no matter what we do. But I think in some senses, the antidote to that is to change the way we think about place, right? Not as a space of control, but of a place, a space of experience, especially organic experience. How we capture on the page is the difficult question. To me, again, it always comes down to the strangeness and the particularities of detail. So, like you mentioned, yeah, there's sort of this East Coast, West Coast thing going on in the book where it starts out in DC and we move over to the West Coast in Washington. So, thinking about, the technique of writing place with this project in particular, when I was on the West Coast in the Olympic Peninsula, mostly, I was in a place that was really, really important to the person I was with. And in some ways, I think that kind of worked to my benefit as a writer to filter the meaning of the land through someone else who it meant a lot to, was useful. And of course, like whenever we're writing about land, particularly this land, like Turtle Island, the United States, it forces us also, I think, to think very deeply about what it means to be on this land as, for me, a white settler, and contend with this is a very naturalistic book, like you said, right? It's working in a tradition of nature writing, but to really try and think a little critically about what the hell we mean when we say nature and nature writing.
Yeah, I love that. All the layers to what we can accomplish right through that craft and through our own attentions, like what we're pointing out for the reader, or where we're drawing the reader's attention to within the scope of the story. I'm thinking too about the title, right? Distance sequence. And there's a couple ways that we really feel that distance within the pieces, but I'm also thinking, and I'm going a little bit off script, so maybe throwing a new question at you, but I'm thinking about how in the essays the body also becomes a place or a site for kind of coming together, intimacy, of course, a lot of different kind of bodily landscapes. And also this idea of distance, right? Two bodies sort of separated by distance. So I wonder if you could talk about maybe just the function of the title and how you see it kind of working in relation to physical place, but also maybe emotional distance or yeah, this idea of sequencing and how the body and place and kind of these themes are interacting within the space of the collection.
Yeah, so on the most literal level, I mean, it's a book about a long distance relationship, and the moments in which that distance collapses and expands again in the very like physical sense of distance. But I love what you brought up about the landscape of bodies and the push and pull there of intimacy and distance with our own bodies and with another person's body. I kind of made fun of the trans industrial complex already, but this is a memoir and it's very much a trans memoir. It's not about my coming out, which is, I think, one of the pitfalls of the more like big five publisher trans memoir. But what it is about is building a relationship with someone who is in a space of questioning and exploration. And the ways that I, as a trans person who had already been deep into my own transition, the way building a relationship with someone who I feel like hasn't started isn't really a generous way of putting it, but someone who is uh, new to this, I think that's like a little bit, I was going to say it's an unexplored thing in literature, but there's Nevada by Imogen Biddy, like sitting right there. But it is, I think it's like a really interesting tension that I think maybe like a lot of cis readers aren't familiar with, perhaps. This experience of feeling almost like a shepherd in a way that can be appropriate or inappropriate. The sense of responsibility it can give you, again, in a way that is inappropriate and sometimes appropriate, sometimes inappropriate. And the way it makes you think about your own transition in a way that you maybe haven't for a while, if you're several years in. So distance sequence comes up there is like the expanding, contracting of distance from my own transition being brought into the text versus this other person's potential or maybe future transition. And yeah, it's just like a really peculiar intimacy that can exist between two trans people of like at any point in transition, but I think can be really potent and it can be frankly I think it can be a space for like a lot of bad shit. That's not what luckily happened here, but the juxtaposition of, like I said, someone who has been living in their transness for a while for someone who is first exploring it can create both really intense intimacies and really intense distances. So the title I think is like you said, working on a couple levels of the literal, like geographical, physical distance and the interpersonal.
Yeah, no, that's really great. I think Yeah, distance also in the sense of being seen or feeling seen within the space of a relationship too, and that closeness, but also that kind of separation that's necessary at times as well. Yeah, really layered. But thank you for indulging my question as well. And just a reminder to folks, we have about 10 minutes left. So if you have questions, throw them in the chat, but I've got plenty more. So we'll just keep on going until you have one. I would love to really talk in depth about the level of musicality and the kind of sound texture of the language, right? We keep coming back to this texture idea, and the kind of tactile nature of the language that really connects to some of the things we've been talking about, right? The body, place, intimate, right? It really kind of puts us in the moment. And so I just wonder generally how important is kind of sound to you as you write? Does that come in revision? Just how are you working with the language on that more minute scale, with that kind of attention that I think a lot of us think is, more poetry minded. But of course, prose needs that level of attention as well. We're just not used to kind of talking about it in this way.
Yeah, musicality is super important to me. And sound and voice in that sense, like the musicality of voice does come pretty naturally to me as a writer, which isn't to say it doesn't come up in revision either, because when I'm revising, I do a lot of sentence level
Mm.
edits. I'm someone who I like love editing. I could like spend an hour on a paragraph. And I think that is where you can really unlock your musicality is when you sit with a paragraph, you sit with a sentence, and you just literally move around the clauses, um, move around the order of sentences in a paragraph, or even get down to like your word choice and your diction and think about like the musicality of a line, what consonants, what subtle rhymes are existing here. And I think what you'll find is like a lot of lines have a natural music to them that maybe you didn't know you were imbuing in them, but when you take a look, you can hear it. And as soon as you hear, like when you start hearing it, is when you can start doing it on purpose.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I think it's really like sitting with your own work and listening.
Do you read your work out loud as part of that revision process, or are you relying on that internal ear of sorts?
I sometimes read out loud, but I also find that to be like deeply embarrassing, even if I'm alone. So
Embarrassing with yourself. Yeah, no, I feel that too. I think Lauren has a question in the chat that we'll turn to. And it's a question that I always think about as well, right? And maybe a lot of people who approach creative nonfiction do. It also speaks a little bit to this idea of distance, how we might distance ourselves from memory in some way. So the question is, how do you deal with the stress of writing the painful memories?
yeah.
A big question. Thank you,
I'd say
Lauren.
with this project, I the way I dealt with it was not well.
Mm,
That shouldn't be the default. That shouldn't be the only way you can write through this stuff. For me, it was because I think it was difficult because I didn't set out to do that. I was really setting out to write about a very particular moment,
mm,
and the past just kept asserting itself. How do we deal with the stress of writing painful memories? It's going to look different for everyone. I think my advice there was a sort of a friend and sort of mentor figure of mine, Callum Angus, has taught me a lot about the ways that writing is a somatic practice, which I think can feel really challenging to wrap our heads around sometimes because writing feels so like brain to page, right? It
mm,
feels so psychological. But particularly when we're writing through our own memories and particularly painful memories, like we're undergoing a somatic experience. Memories live in our bodies.
Mm.
And when we are tapping into them in order to render them, that is a bodily experience. So I think like the advice I can think of for how to deal with that stress is to be really conscious of your body in a way that you might not naturally be when you're writing. Whether that looks like explicitly doing somatic exercises, that can vary from person to person. But um, yeah, I think it's like grounding yourself in your practice in a really physically and bodily way.
Mm. Yeah. I always think about the ways, right, that memory, but also our sort of creative impulses live within our body and how we take care of one and the other in order to sort of build this practice together. And it always seems like our maybe body is the last thing we think about sometimes when we approach the page. So how to sort of reconnect with that. I think that's really good advice and um, good to put into practice.
Yeah, and I think even outside of like the memory bit,
Mm.
like bringing your body into your practice is going to make you better at writing bodies in general.
Yeah.
You're like aware of your somatic experience, that can be a key to putting that down.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Thank you for the question, Lauren. You mentioned a little bit about your editing process, but I wondered about revision in general. Still keeping on this theme of maybe distance, how important is time for your revision process? Do you need time away from that early draft? Do you write and then immediately start revising? What's your revision strategy look like?
This project, the revision also was kind of an outlier from my like more typical practice. Not only was it written quickly, it was revised quickly because I imposed this deadline on myself of the
Mm.
OutWrite literary contest. So I'm gonna like go beyond this project a little bit in the answer. In general, distance from the page is usually really important to me and very generative.
Mm.
I've been working on a novel for about 3 years, and an entire year of that, I didn't look at it like at all. For me, I think of it as like uh, the work needs to sort of pickle or marinate
Mm.
without me. It needs
Mm.
to, it needs to live on its own for a little while. At the same time, I am someone who also like thinking about this novel project. I'll open up the last thing I wrote. It is like painfully hard for me to not immediately go back and start line it.
Mm.
I'm definitely someone where that is a struggle. To keep myself in the generative place, mind space of putting down new work, new
Mm.
words. I always want to go back and edit the last line, even if I literally just wrote it. And I think now that I'm saying it out loud, I think taking those really intentional breaks from a project helps me with that.
Mm.
And it brings you back with fresh eyes, You've experienced more things, and it's like when if you're working on like a really large oil painting and you've been staring at this corner for like 10 hours, it's like you start to lose perspective.
Mm.
And you start to not only perspective on like the project, but also yourself. Like I feel like you start to lose any gut instincts you might have. So my natural instinct is to edit constantly, but I try to use like distance and breaks to give myself more room.
Mm. Yeah. I think that the word you use, generative, right? It's hard to maintain that space of being generative. I also have that same impulse where okay, I'm going to open up the draft, I'm going to reread everything, and then I'm going to start like messing with it. And then all of a sudden I'm not writing anymore. I'm sort of like trying to deal with what I've already written, and that time away just to sort of give yourself a break and, live outside of the work and then bring new things back to it can be really important as well.
Yeah, I know people who have such an opposite experience.
Mm.
The generative bit is their default. That's where they're having fun. It's not that I don't enjoy the generative writing, but I just have a lot of fun editing, and it makes sense to me. I like editing myself. I like editing other people. So I don't think that's an instinct to fight against per se, but you have to understand when it's not serving you.
Yeah. 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 It's finding that balance, right? Okay. How do I kind of follow my impulses, but still get the project to where I need it to be or to where I want it to be at a certain point? Um, all right. I think we're just at about the end mark. So I want to end with our final question, which is, what is your go-to craft advice? Maybe someone comes to you for just general advice, or someone who's just starting out on their writing journey. What is your kind of go-to piece of advice?
I should have thought about this question more. I had it ahead of time, and yet I failed to think about it. Um, what's coming to me in this moment, I think I am really interested in writing transgressively,
Mm.
whether that's in form and genre breaking or in like the actual content of what I'm writing about. Um, Kind of because of that, at the same time, I wrestle with a lot of like personal internal voices of um, basically imagining like the least generous, the most bad faith
Mm.
interpretation of something I'm writing. I've definitely struggled with that. I think the first person, like the first writer who kind of broke through to me about that was Gretchen Felker Martin.
Mm.
She also writes like incredibly transgressive horror fiction, and I can't remember exactly how she phrased it, but it was just that if you're writing to your worst audience, you're gonna write your worst work. And if you're always imagining what's the worst way someone could interpret this, you're not gonna one, you're not gonna write probably at all, and two, you're not gonna write your best work. Um, I don't know how how that goes as like a craft advice, but for me, it's been useful to try and like quiet those internal criticisms, those preemptive criticisms I'm kind of coming up for myself that aren't about the craft of the work. They're not about the quality or the meaning of the work. It's this idea of purely like, whether it's transphobia or like queerphobia or like um, anything against like portraying sexuality on the page. I really have to like kind of dispel that. So yeah, don't write to your worst audience.
I think that's a beautiful way to end and a great reminder, I think, to all of us, right? Write your best work, not for that worst audience. I love that. It's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Luke, for your time and your generosity this evening. Everyone, please, please, please buy a copy of Distance Sequence. I'm sure by now you are dying to get your hands on this book so that you can read all of the essays and engage with all of the amazing work here. Thank you for spending your evening with us. And Luke, it's been great to have you here.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.